Okay, Richard Murphy, what is this GERS thing?
GERS is Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland statement. Now, it's a weird description in its own right. Nobody puts expenditure before revenue, but it happens in Scotland. What's it about? It supposedly is a measure of how much income is received by the government in Scotland and how much is spent for the benefit of Scotland. So it gives an idea of what Scotland's balance of account with regard to taxation and spending is.
So what's wrong with that then?
The trouble with GERS is that it was set up to be biased. It measures income in Scotland, but measures expenditure for Scotland. And there's a big difference, because the expenditure for Scotland includes a lot of money that is spent nowhere near Scotland. Embassies way beyond the shores of the UK, which Scotland wouldn't necessarily have. Armed forces that Scotland wouldn't necessarily choose to have. But importantly as well, not only is all this expenditure from Westminster charged to Scotland, but none of the tax that is paid by the people who benefit from that expenditure is credited to Scotland. So in other words, it's biased because the income is always going to be understated compared to the expenditure. So there's a balance against Scotland built into the design of the whole statement.
So you're saying that all of the, quote, regions of the UK are in deficit if they had a equivalent of GERS?
If every part of the UK had a GERS account, everywhere except the southeast of England would be in significant deficit. And to some extent, we can see that in the data published by the Office for National Statistics for the UK as a whole. Everywhere is in deficit against the southeast of England. And let's think about why that is. Because we're talking about the gross domestic product, in a sense, of the country and the taxes paid on it. And vast amounts of income from Scotland, from Northern Ireland, from Wales, from the regions of England, flows to London. What is that flows there? Interest is all accounted for by banks in London. Lots of rents are accounted for by head offices in London. The accounts of most major companies are in London. And therefore all the accounting is in the southeast of England, and the tax is credited to the southeast of England as a result. But it's actually earned in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and so on. So these accounts are something that I call crap. Now, crap here means completely rubbish approximations to the truth, because that's what GERS is.
And what would be the big things that would benefit Scotland if it was a nation state as opposed to a region of a nation state?
If Scotland was treated as a nation state, we'd be looking at the decisions made by Scotland for Scotland and accounting for those. Now, I'm not saying that Scotland wouldn't have a deficit. Actually, most countries should run deficits, and there's very good reasons why that's a very good thing to do. So I'm not arguing there won't be a deficit, but it would be a very different deficit, because Scotland would choose what it needed for its own benefit. And there's a lot of things that, frankly, we can see that Westminster does that nobody in Scotland would want. We'd be changing foreign policy, we'd be changing defence policy, we'd be changing energy policy, we'd be looking very differently at how we run many of the national services, which are hopelessly inefficient. For example, the market-led NHS in England compared to the nationally run NHS in Scotland. Fundamentally different approaches to many of these issues. So we'd end up with a very different set of accounts for Scotland, reflecting the priorities of Scotland and not the priorities of Westminster.
Why are you saying a deficit's a good thing? I mean, and does every country run a deficit?
If you have a growing economy, and most countries want a growing economy, that doesn't mean to say we're burning lots of carbon, it means we're doing more for each other, then you need more money to make the economy go round. Quite literally, if there are more transactions, you need more money to keep the economy solvent. Who creates the money in the economy? Well, actually, the government does. It's their promise to pay, which is printed on banknotes. And in Scotland, I know those are issued by banks, but they're all backed up by a central bank, and Scotland could have its own central bank. All of that money is backed up by the government's promise to pay. They're the only people who can ultimately create the money. How do they get the money in the economy to make sure there's enough to go round to keep the economy working? By running a deficit. They have to spend it into the economy. They don't print it and give it away. That's not how governments work. They spend it on government programs, and then they tax back a bit less They run a deficit, in other words, to leave enough money in the economy to make sure that all the other transactions can take place. So deficits keep the economy working.
Now, you've been very strong in saying that Scotland requires to have its own national currency. Why is that?
Scotland has to have its own currency for several reasons. First of all, it's got to be able to manage its debts in its own currency. It cannot owe debts in sterling, because if it does, it then has to sell products to England, and it will be England by then, in sterling to earn the currency to pay its debts if they're denominated in sterling. Now, Scotland wants a choice about who it sells to. It doesn't want to have to earn sterling on everything it sells. It might want to earn euros, but if its debts are in sterling, it's got to earn sterling to pay its debts. So the moment you denominate your debts in the currency of another country, you're beholden to that country to sell your product to it, and they've got a stranglehold on you. But they've got another stranglehold as well. We know that the currency is used to manage the economy. It's used to control the interest rates. It's used to control economic policy. And that economic policy would still be set, if Scotland used sterling, it would be set in London for the interests then of England without taking any account of the benefits of Scotland. So Scotland has to make its own decisions on interest rates. It has to decide how it wants to manage its economy, and it can't do that without its own currency. And there's one last fundamental reason why Scotland has to have its own currency. In the last couple of years, we've seen the importance of quantitative easing. That is government money creation to pay for government programs, in this case COVID. None of the COVID programs were paid for with what is called taxpayers' money, and none was paid for with borrowing. All of it was paid for with money creation, quantitative easing. If Scotland hadn't got its own currency, it couldn't, in the face of a similar emergency, create the money to pay for the crisis management that would be necessary. So it's got to have its own currency to be able to manage any crisis that comes its way, and who knows, another might.
But if you have your own currency, aren't there more transactions costs, and couldn't you have a run on that currency, and wouldn't you pay more in interest rates?
There are some problems, of course, of having your own currency. One of them is transaction costs. You will have to sometimes change your money into sterling. But hang on a minute. Scotland already deals with euros, it already deals with dollars, it already deals with yen, it deals with Australian dollars. Where does whiskey go around the world? It isn't all charged for in sterling. Scotland is used to dealing in other currencies. Does it stop those countries from buying whiskey or anything else that Scotland wants to export? No, of course it doesn't. The transaction cost of the currency exchange is tiny if you've got the right products to sell to the world. Scotland needs to emphasise the importance of having the right products to sell to the world. The transaction cost is neither here nor there.